I still remember the exact moment my dad told me about the mountain trip. It wasn't just the thought of the hike that sent a ripple of excitement through me. It was Peter. Peter wasn't just any family friend. He was the same Peter I hadn't seen since I was 18, back when he and my dad worked together on some construction projects. At the time, I admired him in the kind of way you admire someone who seems larger than life. He had this effortless charm, a laugh that filled a room, and a quiet confidence that seemed to anchor everyone around him. But now, I was 22, and things were different. I was different. Back then, I hadn't come out yet, hadn't even fully acknowledged to myself who I really was. But now I was living as my authentic self, comfortable in my skin. The thought of being around Peter again stirred up a strange mix of nostalgia and something deeper. The car ride to the trailhead was a strange kind of torture. My dad and Peter were deep in conversation, reminiscing about old times, trading jokes, and catching up. I mostly sat in the back, chiming in occasionally, but mostly I just listened to Peter's voice. It was deeper than I remembered, richer. Every time he laughed, that hearty sound I used to admire, it sent a quiet thrill through me. I found myself noticing little things about him that I hadn't before. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his hands, strong and calloused, gripped the steering wheel, the way his head tilted slightly when he listened. Back then, I might have chalked it up to admiration. But now I knew better. When we finally arrived at the trailhead, the air was crisp, carrying the sharp, earthy scent of pine and soil. The mountain rose before us, its jagged peaks framed by an impossibly blue sky. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This wasn't just a hike, it felt like a journey into uncharted territory, both the wilderness and whatever was awakening inside me. The trail was steeper than I'd expected, winding through dense forests and over rocky outcrops. My dad led the way, his energy seemingly endless, while Peter and I fell into step together. His presence beside me was steady, reassuring, but it also made my heart race in a way I couldn't quite control. By the time we reached a clearing to rest, my legs were burning and I was drenched in sweat. My dad, ever the athlete, plopped down on a boulder with a contented sigh, guzzling water. Peter, though, remained standing, surveying the view like it was nothing, and then, without warning, he pulled off his shirt. The world seemed to stop. He tugged the hem of his shirt upward in one smooth motion, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. His chest was every bit as defined as I'd imagined it might be, broad shoulders tapering into firm pecs and a taut, sculpted abdomen. The sunlight caught on his skin, which glistened faintly with sweat, and the way his muscles moved, flexing subtly as he wrung out his shirt, was hypnotic. I tried to look away, I really did, but my eyes betrayed me, tracking the beads of sweat as they rolled down his chest, over the ridges of his abs, and disappeared into the waistband of his hiking shorts. There was something so raw about the moment, so unguarded. It was as if he was entirely unaware of the effect he was having on me, or maybe he wasn't. "You doing okay?" Peter asked, his voice pulling me out of my haze. His tone was casual, friendly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A knowing glint, maybe? I swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yeah, just catching my breath." He grinned, that easy, disarming grin that had always unsettled me. "Good. Still a ways to go, but you're keeping up. I'm impressed." The words shouldn't have meant as much as they did, but they landed like a weight in my chest. My dad chimed in then, something about how I'd always been stubborn when it came to challenges, and the moment passed. As we continued the hike, I couldn't shake the image of him, bare-chested, confident, and entirely magnetic. My mind was a whirlpool of conflicting emotions. The thrill of being near him, the guilt of harboring such feelings about someone my dad so obviously trusted, and the gnawing curiosity about whether he had any inkling of what was going through my head. By the time we reached the next rest stop, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting golden light over everything. Peter sat down beside me this time, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. "You've grown up a lot since I last saw you." he said, his tone soft, almost contemplative. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I glanced at him, my heart pounding. Was that just a passing observation, or was there something more beneath the surface? Yeah, I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. A lot can change in 4 years. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yeah, it can. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence between us charged with something I couldn't name. My dad was a few feet away, obliviously rummaging through his pack for snacks, and I wondered if he'd feel this same electricity if he looked at us right now. As we prepared to continue the hike, Peter's hand brushed mine, just for a second, but long enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. He didn't say anything, didn't even look at me, but the smallest smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I didn't know what the rest of this trip would hold, but one thing was certain. It was already becoming far more than just a hike. I could only hope Peter hadn't noticed the way my eyes lingered on him, the way my breath caught whenever he smiled, but part of me wondered if he had. After our break, we packed up and kept moving, the trail narrowing as we climbed higher into the mountains. The conversation flowed easily, my dad leading most of it, his voice filling the spaces between the trees. But Peter and I exchanged these small, lingering glances that seemed to carry more meaning than words ever could. There was something in the air, or maybe it was just in my head. Every step felt charged with a kind of electricity I hadn't anticipated. It was like being pulled toward something I couldn't name, and every glance Peter threw my way only added to that pull. The plan was to camp overnight in a simple setup, tents and a small fire under the open sky. By the time we reached a suitable clearing, the sun had dipped low, casting the landscape in shades of gold and deepening blue. The temperature had dropped just enough to make the warmth of the campfire a welcome comfort. My dad and I worked together to get the fire going while Peter focused on setting up the tents. It was supposed to be straightforward. My dad would have his tent, I'd have mine, and Peter his. But after several minutes of struggling with his setup, Peter let out a low curse, stepping back and wiping his hands on his pants. One of the poles was bent, or maybe the fabric had warped over time. Either way, it was clear the tent wasn't going to stand, no matter how much we tried to force it. My dad, ever practical, shrugged it off. "Well, you've got 2 options," he said with a laugh. "Sleep under the stars or bunk with one of us." My pulse quickened. The thought of Peter sharing my tent, of being that close to him, sent a jolt of something electric through me. Before I could second-guess myself, I offered. "You can share mine," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "It's not huge, but it'll work." Peter's gaze flicked to me, his lips curving into a small smile. "Thanks. I'll take you up on that." My dad, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling between us, nodded his approval and went back to setting up his space for the night. As the fire crackled and night settled in, the conversation slowed. The day's hike had taken its toll, and we ate our simple meal mostly in silence. My dad retired early, muttering something about needing a good night's sleep before the next leg of the trip. His snores started almost immediately, leaving Peter and me alone by the fire. The quiet wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, weighted with something unspoken. Peter leaned back against a log, the firelight flickering across his features, and I couldn't help but steal glances at him. There was something about the way he looked in that moment, so at ease, yet so commanding. Eventually, we both decided to call it a night. Crawling into my small tent together felt surreal. The space was tight, forcing us closer than I'd anticipated. Our legs brushed as we got situated, and the warmth of his body seemed to radiate through the thin fabric of our sleeping bags. The sounds of the night, rustling leaves, the occasional pop of the dying fire, and my dad's soft snores filled the silence between us. It felt like the world outside the tent had disappeared, leaving only this small, intimate space. Peter broke the quiet first, his voice low and casual. "So, any fiancé waiting back home?" It was such an innocent question, the kind of thing people ask without thinking, but to me, it was loaded. My heart thudded in my chest. This was the moment, The opening I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I took a breath and decided to go for it. "No fiancé," I said softly. "No girlfriend either. There won't ever be one." I paused, feeling the words hang in the air. Then I added, "I'm gay." The admission came out smoother than I'd expected, but my pulse quickened all the same. There was a moment of silence, just a heartbeat really, but it felt like an eternity. And then Peter spoke. "So am I," he said, his tone calm, almost matter-of-fact. 5 years now. His words hit me like a thunderclap. My mind reeled and my body went still. It was like the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been holding finally clicked into place. The glances, the tension, the unspoken understanding, it all made sense now. I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly the space between us vanished. My hand reached out almost instinctively, my fingers grazing his arm. His skin was warm, solid, grounding. I felt him exhale, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to shatter the stillness around us. Before I knew it, my hand was sliding lower, tracing the contours of his body. The air in the tent grew thick with the weight of unspoken desire, the kind that had been building all day. Peter didn't say a word, but the way his body responded told me everything I needed to know. His breath hitched as my hand ventured lower, and I felt the tension coiled within him finally begin to unravel. It was surreal, almost dreamlike. The two of us in that tiny enclosed space, our world reduced to the quiet sounds of our breathing and the heat of our bodies. Just meters away, my dad's snores continued, oblivious to the moment unfolding so close by. Time lost meaning. Every touch, every whisper of breath felt amplified, more vivid than anything I'd ever experienced. When it was over, we lay there in the dark, the silence between us no longer heavy but full of understanding. We didn't need words. Whatever had just happened felt right, like the culmination of something long overdue. As I lay there, my hand still resting against Peter's, I felt a deep sense of clarity. This trip was meant to be more than just a hike. It was the start of something I hadn't even dared to imagine. The next morning, it was as if nothing had happened. I woke up with the first light creeping through the thin fabric of the tent, my body still buzzing from the night before. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if it had all been some vivid dream conjured by exhaustion and desire. But the weight of it lingered. The adrenaline, the heat, the way my heart had raced in the dark. Peter was already up, moving around camp like it was just another day in the mountains. He gave me a glance, quick and subtle, accompanied by a small, easy smile. No words, no acknowledgement of the night we'd shared. If there was a flicker of something beneath his calm exterior, I couldn't see it. My dad, still snoring in his tent, remained oblivious. A blessing, really. The thought of him finding out was enough to send a shiver down my spine, but at the same time, the secrecy added a strange thrill to everything. We packed up camp and hit the trail again, the three of us falling into our usual rhythm. My dad led the way, talking about the weather, the views, and how great it was to be out in the fresh air. I nodded along, throwing in the occasional, "Yeah," or "That's amazing," but my mind was elsewhere. Every time I glanced at Peter, my pulse quickened. His calm demeanor was maddening, like he hadn't been with me in the tent last night, like I hadn't felt him tense under my touch. It left me questioning everything. Was it just a moment to him? Some fleeting thing to be left behind on the trail? Or did it mean something more? We stopped to rest at one point, and as my dad rummaged through his pack, I stole another glance at Peter. He caught my eye just for a second, and there it was, a flicker of something unspoken. His expression was neutral, but his eyes betrayed him, carrying a spark of heat that sent a shiver through me. It was enough. That glance, that split second, told me we were on the same page. Whatever last night had been, it wasn't over. We both knew there was another night ahead, and the anticipation simmered beneath the surface, almost unbearable. By the time we reached our second campsite, my body was humming with it. My dad, still blissfully unaware, chatted as he set up his tent, talking about how we'd finish the hike tomorrow. He didn't notice the way Peter and I avoided each other's gaze, or how my hands trembled just slightly as I unpacked. After dinner, my dad retired to his tent with a casual, "See you in the morning," and within minutes, his snores began to fill the quiet night. I sat by the fire, the dying embers casting faint shadows across the ground. My body wound tight with anticipation. Peter was only a few feet away in his tent, but the distance felt infinite. I couldn't relax, couldn't quiet my racing thoughts. Every rustle of leaves, every pop of the fire felt magnified in the stillness. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dragging endlessly. And then, finally, I heard the soft sound of a zipper. Peter appeared at the entrance of my tent, his silhouette blocking out the faint light from outside. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The way he slipped inside, silent and sure, said everything. My heart pounded as he knelt beside me, his body brushing against mine in the cramped space. He gave me a look, one that made my breath catch, a mix of mischief and promise, like he knew exactly what I was thinking and planned to deliver on it. Without a word, his hands moved to my waistband, tugging my pants down just enough for the cool night air to brush against my skin. The sensation was fleeting, replaced almost instantly by the warmth of his hands. My body jolted at his touch, every nerve ending firing at once. And then his mouth followed. The heat of it, the way he moved with such confidence and precision, sent a shockwave through me. It was overwhelming in the best way, a flood of sensation that left me clinging to the thin fabric of the tent for grounding. My dad's snores continued just meters away, loud and steady, but they might as well have been miles. In that moment, the world shrank to just Peter and me. He took his time, every movement deliberate, like he was savoring each second. My body responded instinctively, a shuddering exhale escaping my lips before I bit down hard, trying to stay quiet. The risk of discovery only heightened everything. The thrill, the tension, the intensity of it all. When it was over, Peter pulled back, his breathing heavy but controlled, his confidence unshaken. He gave me a quick grin, a flash of teeth in the dim light, before slipping out of the tent as quietly as he'd come in. I lay there for what felt like hours, my heart still racing, my body thrumming with energy. The night around me felt surreal, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, and my dad's steady snores just meters away. I just had one of the most intense experiences of my life, lying in a tent in the middle of the wilderness with Peter. It was insane, reckless, and yet it felt so right. As I stared up at the faint outline of the tent's ceiling, a small smile tugged at my lips. This trip was supposed to be about reconnecting with nature, about adventure and bonding. And it was, but not in the way I had expected. This was something else entirely, something I wasn't sure I could ever put into words. The next morning arrived too quickly. The sky was still painted in pale shades of dawn as we packed up camp, the sun climbing lazily over the horizon. It felt strange, after everything that had happened over the past 2 nights, to be going through the motions of a normal morning routine. My dad, in his usual cheerful mood, cracked jokes as he folded his tent, already making plans for our next adventure. He was completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had taken place between Peter and me. And Peter? He played it cool, the same easygoing, relaxed guy he always was. If someone had seen him then, they'd never guess that just hours ago he had been in my tent, his hands and mouth igniting something in me I hadn't known was there. The descent down the mountain was easier on the legs, but somehow heavier on the heart. Maybe it was the knowledge that the trip was ending, that reality was waiting for us at the bottom. Part of me was relieved. I needed time to process what had happened, to figure out what it meant, if it even meant anything at all. But another part of me wasn't ready. I didn't want to go back to the way things had been before, where Peter was just my dad's best friend. Not after what we had shared. The hike down was quiet, at least for Peter and me. My dad filled the silence with his usual chatter, oblivious as always. The tension between Peter and me hung in the air, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that we'd crossed a line, The question now was, what lay on the other side? When we finally reached the parking lot, it felt surreal to see other people again, to hear the distant hum of cars and see the familiar signs of civilization. After 2 days in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but nature and the intimacy of what had transpired, reality felt jarring. We piled into the car, my dad suggesting we grab food in the nearby town before heading home. Peter agreed, his voice casual, his smile easy. Meanwhile, I sat in the back seat, my thoughts spiraling. Sitting across from Peter in the diner, everything felt too normal. My dad talked about the trip, recounting highlights and planning future hikes, while Peter and I exchanged glances across the table. Each one was brief but charged, like a silent reminder that no, I hadn't imagined it. After lunch, the drive home felt endless. My dad and Peter talked up front, the low hum of the radio filling the gaps, but I barely heard a word. My thoughts were racing ahead. Was this just something that happened in the heat of the moment, something left behind in the mountains? Or was it something more? When we pulled into my dad's driveway, Peter didn't linger. He and my dad exchanged their usual goodbyes, plans for a drink next week, a quick pat on the back. Then Peter turned to me. His eyes locked with mine for a second, just long enough to say everything he couldn't with my dad standing there. And then he was gone, driving off down the street and leaving me standing there, my dad cheerfully unloading gear like nothing had changed. But everything had. It started subtly. At first, Peter would stop by under the guise of catching up with my dad, grabbing a coffee, watching a game on TV. But each time we'd find moments to steal away, even if just for a few minutes. And it wasn't long before we picked up exactly where we'd left off. It was electric. I couldn't get enough of him. The way he made me feel, the way being with him just felt right. We weren't just sneaking around for the thrill of it. It was deeper than that, something neither of us could ignore. Now, at 21 years old, I'm dating a 45-year-old man, a man who also happens to be my dad's best friend. It sounds insane when I say it out loud, but it works. We work. This isn't some reckless fling or doomed forbidden romance. It's real, steady, and grounded in something that feels unshakable. My dad? He still hasn't caught on, and we're careful. We have to be. But sometimes, I wonder how long we can keep this up before he starts putting the pieces together. For now, though, I'm happy. Happier than I've been in a long time, and that's enough.